Hello, Holistic Chamber of Commerce family. Welcome to today's Meet a Member segment. I have Fausta Luchini today. I was like, oh, I love that. So Italian name, Luchini.
And you
Um,
said that perfectly.
I think I was an Italian in a past life. That's why. Just
Mhm.
saying. Fausta is a certified whole person coach with a master's in clinical psychology and has over 15 years experience as a psychotherapist. She became a coach to support people who are dealing with overwhelm, stress, and who are at risk for burnout. She lives in a multi-generational home in Savannah, Georgia with her life partner Dennis, her daughter and two grandchildren, loves being close to the ocean. Welcome, Fausta.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I'm really excited for this.
Yeah. So we're going
Mm.
to talk a little bit about pausing and reconnecting with our own wisdom. And I know that you're going to kind of weave this into what it is you do. And ultimately, you are a trauma sensitive consultant and coach. So let's talk about how you got into this line of work.
Yeah. So, when I was a therapist, I worked in community mental health for a long time. And the community that I was working in began to experience more and more violence. And so there was a lot of trauma going on with our clients. And I began to see that that trauma was rippling through communities and touching so many lives, right? Um, and then one day I went to the park and I was enjoying the fresh air and just being outside. I saw a couple of three teenagers, two boys, a girl, and a big dog. And all of a sudden, Lori, I had this moment of panic. I thought, something bad is about to happen. I don't know what it is. I didn't know if the teenagers were going to do something or if somebody was going to do something. I mean, I wanted to run over to them and tell them to go home because they weren't safe. But I knew that was a little over the top, so I didn't do that. I left myself instead, and I got home and I thought, "What on earth just happened? That was really weird." And I began to see how my experience at work with my clients who were suffering, and then with the therapists who were suffering, had begun to impact me. And so that was my own personal experience with secondary trauma. And I discovered that I began to realize I was getting up in the morning and reading the newspaper to see if anybody I knew had been shot. That was a huge change, right? I was waking up in the middle of the night worried about clients. And so that at risk of burnout space has started me on a lifelong quest, really, to find ways that we can take care of ourselves and ways that we can stay connected with our own deep wisdom, right?
Mm. Yeah, and a lot of us here in the community are service providers, whether, it's wellness, we variety of treatment modalities, and sometimes our clients share with us things that,
Yeah.
if we're not really trained, we may not necessarily know what to do with it, but
Mhm.
their stories can really, impact us emotionally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so that was discovering secondary trauma and learning to take care of myself and the therapist, other therapists helping us as a center sort of manage what was happening.
Mm.
Um, and then of course now we talk about collective trauma and intergenerational trauma. And so the mindset has gone really from trauma as this very personal thing that happens to us to a much wider perspective of how that lands with us and how difficult it is. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's like you're seeing that pop up more and more. Like even in yoga, there's trauma sensitive yoga. People are
yeah,
becoming more mindful of that.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just agreeing with
No,
you.
no, that's perfect. I'm so glad. Um, yeah, because it's just interesting. And honestly, I can talk about trauma all day long. I know that's a little odd, but there it is. So what I begin to realize is that we all need to do this work to take care of ourselves. And that's one of the most important things for me about being trauma sensitive is that while people that are trauma informed it tends to focus on the knowledge, right? And like knowing that you don't ask people what's wrong with you. It's, what's happened to you kinds of approaches. And with trauma sensitive coaching, it's important to look at the idea that trauma is not something that happens to other people. It happens to all of us
Mhm.
in some ways, right? Now, how much it affects us may be different, and what that looks like may be different. But being trauma sensitive is not an us them perspective. It always starts with me.
Mhm.
And then once I'm able to be connected with myself, once my nervous system is regulated, when I'm okay, then I can move into helping other people figure out how to connect with themselves and what tools they might need to add to really be okay, to feel okay.
So to clarify for people that are listening and watching this,
Yeah.
your clients that you work with, are they other like practitioners that may be experiencing secondary trauma, or do you work directly with people who understand, I've experienced a trauma and I need help with this?
So really, it's a combination. I do work with a number of providers, um, which is, powerful and wonderful work because they're really talented and gifted. Um, but I also work just directly with people, and sometimes we don't even talk about trauma. Sometimes being trauma sensitive is just more about understanding how trauma affects us. So it's a strength based approach. It is not about what symptoms are you having? How can we make you better? How can we fix this? It's what can we do to foster your own emotional well being and your growth so that you're able to do the things that then will lead to healing and recovery if there is damage, if there is suffering, because we all suffer, right?
Mhm. You talk about like reconnecting with our own wisdom. What
Mhm.
role does that have in what you're talking about here with trauma and being exposed to things, whether directly or indirectly?
It is absolutely at the center of the work. Trauma disconnects us from, this is from Thomas Hubble, I believe, um, disconnects us from ourselves, from others, and even from nature. And so our task is to reconnect with all those things. But unless you can connect with yourself, you don't know what you want or you don't know what you need. Stress gets thrown at us over and over and so many stressors, right? It begins to feel like a threat. And we know that when we experience a sense of threat, our frontal cortex kind of shuts down. It thinks we're going to have to fight or run. When that happens, you hear people say, I'm so stressed I can't think straight. That's actually true. And so reconnecting with yourself allows you to pause and take that. You were kind of laughing about the length of my website name, right? With good reason. I mean, that's just place to ponder. It's a little long. But I have this mental image of like a pool where you're drowning in stress or other people's pain, right? And you're just barely treading water, keeping your head up there. And a lily pad that's there that you can get out on. And so you haven't left the pool. You haven't walked away from everybody and everything, but you've got a space where you literally can begin to think again and reconnect with yourself. So that's so much at the heart of it.
Hmm. Now, what makes you different than, say, a trauma therapist? Because, like, my background's in psychotherapy. I was trained in trauma, EMDR, and all of that. But I know there's a difference between like
Yep,
coaching, consulting, and therapy. So,
absolutely.
what is different about the work that you're doing here?
First of all, I don't diagnose anything. I don't ask for symptoms. I don't ask necessarily, how many nights a week are you not sleeping kind of thing. Um, and we don't focus on what's wrong. It is really a strengths based approach. I have clients that don't even talk about their trauma. I also don't do processing of trauma. So if you need to go back to your childhood experiences and really connect with the things that have happened, whether that's through EMDR or other techniques, that's not something that I'm going to touch. Um, that's a different level of care, and
Mhm.
therapy is. And I've done that work as a therapist, so I know that I don't need to do that as a coach. That's not what it's about. Um, I like to talk about it being more about moving towards post traumatic growth. But there are so many misconceptions about that concept that I've kind of backed away from that. And I just say it's about blossoming, it's about developing. It's, you know, it's dealing with collective trauma.
Mhm.
It's dealing with sometimes intergenerational trauma and of course
Yeah,
secondary.
I appreciate that you have both the experience on the therapy side, but also on the coaching side, because it is different. And I'm
Yeah.
not quite sure, like, not to say that like trauma coaches don't know what they're doing, because many of them are trained and they're trained well. But
Right.
when you have the therapy background and experience, you know the difference between the two, and you
Yeah.
know the difference between what client works with what modality, because there is a time for therapy, but there's also a
Yes.
time for coaching.
Yep. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And I would send somebody to therapy in a heartbeat if they need to really look back and do that kind of work.
Yeah.
Looking at the rules
That's so
around.
valuable. Like, that piece right there is so valuable for somebody.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah.
You wanted to talk about what was it, the different types? There was something you wanted to go into that you were telling me
So
when
I
we were
was
chatting.
so I was doing the different aspects of trauma sensitive coaching. And
Okay.
so I talked about self-based. I talked about it being everybody, and it
Mhm.
has to come from the provider as well. I talked about it being strengths-based, and I mentioned it being systems-based. So those three things are super important. Beyond that, once people have reconnected with themselves, there are a lot of tools that I bring to this, because I've been doing this work for a really long time in one form or another, right? So I often use cognitive behavioral coaching because we get stuck in self limiting patterns of thinking, right? And are unable to break out of that. And so helping people figure out, what am I thinking? What am I saying to myself? What story am I telling myself about what's happening here? And is that a fact? Or is that just my opinion? Even sometimes I just make stuff up. I'll tell myself, this didn't happen, and that must mean, you're a failure. Not really.
You do that a lot. Make stuff up.
Right. Right. So beginning to sort through some of that and just figure out what is factual. Because if it is a fact, this unpleasant thing you're saying to yourself, maybe you need to do something different. It's not like you need to just think positive all the time. Sometimes there's maybe a skill that you need to add or something a change you need to make, an action to take. But sorting through some of that can be super helpful. I'm a trained teacher in mindful self-compassion, which has been life-changing for me. I used to think I was compassionate to myself. Not so much.
In self-forgiveness, and compassion, I think they kind of go hand in hand. It's so tough.
Mhm.
Sometimes we're much better at forgiving other people than we are ourselves.
Absolutely. People are amazingly hard on themselves.
Hmm.
But it's not like we teach children how to be self-compassionate.
Right.
We just kind of want them to do what they need to do, or at least we used to, right? I think we're a little bit better about that. But still, for most of us as adults, learning self-compassion comes much later in
Mhm.
life. And so self-compassion not only teaches us to be kind to ourselves and affirming and validating, right? But there's also the active component of self-compassion, which involves being able to provide, protect, and motivate yourself the way a good coach would. And so it's like being able to say no, sometimes to other people, sometimes to myself. I'm not a big fan of saying no to myself, but sometimes it's the compassionate thing to do, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For
I
sure.
can't really eat ice cream every day.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes we need to stop ourselves from going into things that sound really good and might look good to others, but like deep down, we really don't want it. So we really do have to
Yes.
say, no, sounds good, but no.
And that wraps us back to being connected with yourself, right?
Mhm,
Because if you're not, you don't know what you want.
mhm.
And then that ties into the mindfulness piece.
Right.
And so you need the mindfulness so that you can pause again and ask yourself, what's going on right now?
Mhm.
What's happening within me? What am I noticing? And
Right.
that's really valuable.
Right.
Ah, this is so much fun.
Oh, good. Good. Well, we have a few minutes left. You said you wanted to take just like a minute and do an exercise with people.
Hmm. Oh, yeah. So I just finished a class. I love classes. It was a 60-hour certificate class in integrative somatic trauma therapy.
Mm,
And I learned a bunch of somatic skills that have really been mind opening for me and for my clients. So I want to invite you to do one. These are practices that help us regulate our nervous systems and really bring us to a sense of more calm, right? So, not that we have to be calm all the time because nobody is. And sometimes that's not the right state to be in. But when you want to lower your levels, for example, you can do a practice like this. And I'll invite you just to get a little bit comfortable in your chair, right? And then turn your hands palms up and just notice. Just look at your palms and think for a minute about all of the things that our hands do for us. Maybe feel even a sense of gratitude for our hands. And then, if you bring your hands together, palms facing each other, noticing the warmth in the places they touch. And you can begin to move them a little bit if you like. Maybe closing over the back of them, feeling the fingers. Again, just noticing the sensations. And then when you're ready, I often like to end just by placing both hands over my heart and noticing the gentle pressure and warmth. Noticing any changes in your body. And then when you're ready, bringing your attention back to the room.
That was nice. It just, for me, it makes me present.
Mhm.
And when you live in the now, there's relief because you're not living in the past, nor are you future projecting.
Yep. Yeah.
Is that the trick? Is that the secret of that thing?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Exactly.
I
Brilliant.
discovered you, Fausta. I know what you're
Absolutely.
doing.
Yep. Ah,
Well, thank you for that.
ah,
So, if someone's watching this and they'd really like to connect with you, how can they do that? You said you had like a free consultation.
I do. Yeah. They can connect on my website. They can email me. They can Facebook message my page if they feel like they need to. But probably emailing me or going to my website, you can schedule a consult through there. If you tell me that you found me through the Holistic Chamber of Commerce, you are, I'll offer you a 15% discount on a package or a service, and would love to hear from you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us
Thank you
and
for having me.
yeah, sharing your knowledge. You have such a calm presence about you. I'm like, this and that, and I like find myself. just
Mhm.
calming down in your presence just because of the tone of your
Yes.
voice.
Thank
So I
you.
can see how someone who might be a little bit like hyper,
Mhm.
not ventilating, not like active, but like
Right.
what like maybe hyper active in mind, how just being in your
Yeah.
presence can be calming. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Co-regulation.
Yes. So
Okay.
thank you,
Thank
Fausta.
you again. Take care.
Have a great rest of your
Great.
day, everybody.
Yeah.